last video, we ended by talking about the potential ways we can try to get at a causal relationship with data. So one of those ways we talked about was multiple regression. So multivariate multiple regression, is a super powerful tool that empirical researchers can use to start to get at causal relationships. And start or attempt might be a key word. I believe it's very underrated. It's not perfect, but it is, first of all, a great first step. Way better than correlation. And again, I want to emphasize this, it's very underrated in what it can do. So what does multiple regression let us do? So it's going to allow us to compare two things. It could be two people, it could be two firms, it could be two countries, it could be two dog sled teams that are exactly the same across several dimensions except for one. And then we're going to be able to alter that dimension and see how that thing affects this. So again, allows us to compare two things, people, etc., that are exactly the same across one dimension and alter this. The great thing about multi-regression is we don't even have to have two things, two people in our data that fit this scenario. This is huge. A lot of people call this holding things constant. Again, comparing two things that are exactly the same. So this is getting close to a medical study. If we imagine a medical study, we might have two petri dishes, right, that are exactly the same across all dimensions, right? And we drop something in one of the dishes and we see what happens. Again, I think the scientists have it easy because they can do things like this. But this is what's more exciting about econometric research dealing with people is we can't do that. But now we can't hold everything constant. We can't keep everything the same. But all the variables we can get, we can hold those things constant, getting closer and closer to that medical study or that science study that we wanted to. So let's have a couple examples, but the main idea here is we're going to compare multivariate regression to correlation. So when you take a stats class, if you ever take a stats class, your stats teacher says at least 25 times that correlation is not causation, right? So let's take a look at some examples where correlation can go wrong, but multi-regression can help us out. So if two variables are correlated, roughly, what does this tell you? So if they're positively correlated, roughly, very roughly, and non-technically, on average, if one is high, the other one is high if they're positively related. If one is low, the other one is low on average, right? No directionality to this. If they're negatively correlated, one is high on average, the other one is low. And if that first one is low on average, the other one is high. It really has to do with how far from the mean and things like that. But that's a good first step, and that's what most people think about. So our first example is when I was working at a university, they found that the two variables, class grade and class attendance, were negatively correlated. So loosely this says, on average, people who are earning higher grades are attending class less often, aren't coming to class as much. So the question is why? What is going on here? So this was very confusing to a lot of the administrators there. So it could be that all teachers at this university, or on average teachers at this university, I should say, are doing a horrible job and you actually hurt your performance. So what I did was I used multivariate regression to control for, not a perfect control, but we controlled for prior performance, ability, and motivation. So what we did is we put in prior GPA as a control and ACT score. So again, prior GPA controls for prior performance, ACT score controls for, you could think about this as kind of a control for ability, but also motivation and also some other things. So it's not a perfect thing at ability, but it does control for a lot of things. So once we control for these two things, so again, multivariate would allow us to look at two people who have the same prior GPA, same ACT score, but one comes to class more often. Then we found that there was a positive relationship. So again, even though we didn't have two people like this, if we compare two people with same prior GPA and same ACT score, but one comes to class more, they would do better in class. So we'll look at how multivariate regression does this in a more technical video. But let's move on to the next example. So this is thanks to Emily Oster, an excellent econometrician at Brown University. So there was this thing in a medical research that just found this correlation that women who drink coffee are also more likely to have miscarriages. So my wife loves coffee, and with her first kid, she decided not to drink coffee. And whose life was miserable because of that? Yes, of course hers, but mine too, right? So Emily Oster looked into this and thought, does this really mean that coffee causes miscarriages? Well, if you look at multivariate regression and you hold the two things constant, woman's age and morning sickness, so now we're comparing two women who are the same age, that might be the more important one, but also amount of morning sickness, there's no evidence that coffee consumption affects miscarriages. So again, if we use multivariate regression and compare two women who are the same across the dimensions of age and morning sickness, there is not going to be any evidence of relationship between coffee consumption and miscarriages. So what's going on here? Well, unfortunately, older women are more likely to have miscarriages, but they're also more likely on average to drink coffee. And women who have nausea are less likely to have miscarriages, and they're probably not drinking as much coffee because they're sick all the time. So again, this was observational data that we talked about in the first video. So really, what's driving this result are that women who are older are more likely to have miscarriages, but they're also more likely to drink coffee. And women who have nausea are probably less likely to drink coffee, but are also less likely to have miscarriages. So again, once we compare two women who are the same on these two dimensions, getting close to that medical study, not everything, but these two dimensions, there is no evidence that coffee consumption increases miscarriage. So in the next video, we're going to look at a little more technical of this, but don't forget this is what all that technicalness does. Thanks again for listening to the end.